I'm on screen. All right, well, for those of you joining us online, I am going to intro what we're going to do here and tell you about the Build seminars in general, especially since some of my friends here in the room that are live were asking me as the lead up to my microphone being turned on. So, by the way, I'm Tim Peace, if you don't know. And I'm the teaching minister at Mount Carmel Christian Church. And this is what we call our Build seminars. Build seminars are designed to be in-depth level on Bible topics and other matters of living out your faith in different aspects of life. So we will always offer a Bible seminar type class, but we also will offer other things like parenting, marriage, different things like that moving forward. We will be offering Build seminars about 3 times a year. The Bible classes that we are doing are going to be 4 weeks in length each time. So I'll tell you a little bit about why that is, but this is something that's going to be happening regularly. This is our first one. And so we are doing this hybrid. We're doing it with friends in the room here, and we're always happy to have people here with us. But we recognize that we live in a day and age where people like to be able to access things online. And so for those of you online, thank you for joining us. We will continue offering this hybrid format moving forward. And so, as far as the Bible stuff for the Build seminars, this is our first one. We've already written 3 of these, so we have the whole year of these mapped out. My friend Bobby Miller, who I think is an online participant tonight, has been working on these with me, and we started with the parables because, quite frankly, we thought they were really interesting. And then this is crazy, if you're part of Mount Carmel, as you all are in the room here, you'll know we ended up deciding to turn it into a sermon series. And then we're even going to have small group curriculum rooted around that, so the parables of that. Moving forward, we're going to talk about subjects such as, is the Old Testament relevant for Christians today? That'll be our next one. That'll be in the early portion of 2022. And then we're going to be doing one on a study of the church and the nature of the church after that. So, and we're going to keep writing more of them, and eventually we'll be stacking ones where people can select whichever one they want to attend, and so on and so forth. So this one that you're at tonight will be tonight in 3 more weeks, and it's on the parables. And one of the reasons that we chose the parables, other than us being interested in the parables, and we all like Jesus around here, is the fact that parables are some of the most compelling aspects of Jesus' teaching, and they're often some of the most misunderstood. And so we also picked the parables because teaching through the parables and about how to study the parables gets to the heart of what our Build seminars exist for. And that is that we want to help people study the Bible better by studying the Bible together. And so if you come to these seminars, my hope is that you will not just learn something about the Bible, but you'll learn how to study the Bible on your own better. So we're going to let you on the inside to how we grasp the context of the scriptures, how we think about the different aspects of the text, like what kind of literary genre it is. You know, we have poetry in the Bible, we have these parables, we have narrative stories, we have history, we have Psalms. Yes, absolutely. So there's so much a vast array of things to explore in the Bible, and so helping people to better study it on their own can help them to grow in their faith. And so that's why we started with the parables, because they're kind of a fun one to teach people a little bit of background about. So for this particular series, if you are in the room, you have this packet that you were handed. This packet has our outline for all 4 sessions. So don't lose it, or I'll be forced to print another one for you. I'm just kidding. But keep this because we'll keep using it. But tonight, we'll go through the first session, which is an introduction to parables. If you are online, I just want to make a note to you. You might be wondering, well, I'm at home and I don't have a packet. What am I going to do? Well, guess what? If you are on Church Online, we've put the packet in the notes via a link. And if you are watching on YouTube, if you click on the description on the video, you'll find a link to download the PDF as well. So you have access to this packet, and you can follow along that way if you would like to do that. And so that is kind of the lay of the land. And you all didn't come here to go through a syllabus or something like that. We came here to study the parables, right? So let's go ahead and jump into this. So, part 1, an introduction to the parables. And I do want to start out by asking you all a question. What are some things that you have heard? What are some things that you might have thought about parables, what they mean, what their purpose is? Anybody giving any thought to that? That's a good point. So didn't Jesus use them so people of the day would understand what he's trying to say? Yes, on one hand, that is true. Jesus, you get the impression that he looked at the everyday person, thought about what their life might entail, what they put their hands to, what their business dealings might be like, and he would draw a story out of that to make a point about the kingdom, for instance. Of course, Jesus also, when he teaches the parables, often will refer to a passage in Isaiah where he'll say that he teaches in parables so that though hearing or though listening, people don't understand or perceive, which always baffles us because we're like, wait a minute, Jesus, don't you want people to get it? Don't you want them to join in? What are you saying here? And we'll get to a little bit of what he meant by that. So, yeah, on one hand, yeah, he wants people to understand. On another hand, there's that weird stuff he says sometimes because Jesus says weird stuff sometimes. Anybody else? That is a really, really good point. There's always more than one meaning to Jesus' parables. That is more true, believe it or not, than most people would like to think. If you look in the paper here, we've put some misconceptions about parables here. And Dee, you just answered the first misconception with some accuracy there. A lot of people maybe have heard something like a parable's a simple story that has only one meaning. And there might be some truth to that in certain parables, but there are oftentimes multiple angles that Jesus wants people to draw out from a simple parable. And so the reason we put that misconception down is because you don't want to take one idea that might be true for one parable and make it the umbrella for all of them, because then you might be reading the other ones in a not real great way. Anyone else? Well, the second misconception we have on here is that a parable is a simple story that is easily understood. So definitely, if there's more than one meaning to a parable, and you think there's only one meaning, then that will create a problem when there's multiple meanings. But there's multiple reasons why this is a misconception that's not accurate. And it's because of the work we modern readers have to do with the parables. When Jesus tells a parable and he starts and says, "A sower went out to sow seed." Now, if you've ever done farming before, you might be able to relate in some manner. I'm boring. I haven't been a farmer before. So right out of the gate, I hear Jesus or I read Jesus' words and I'm like, I did some little potting soil with a flower as a kid, and I think we had tomatoes in a garden when I was a kid, but I haven't done the grueling work of farming before to that extent. And even if you are a farmer today, we have all sorts of mechanical helps and things like that. In the time of Jesus, you have someone that had these precious seeds, had precious little time, had a precious time window in which to do their farming because of not only the geography that people lived in, but also the weather patterns. And so that dictated the when, where, what, how, and why someone could go out and sow seed. And then, we might think, my dad has a farm. It's like 72 acres. If he's watching this online, he'll correct me if my number's wrong later. But it's big. These people probably had a smaller plot of land that they might have owned and might have been passed down family to family. So they not only have to do the hard work, but they don't have much to work with. And they're going out and doing this. So the point is, we read one simple line and we can get our imagination going and try to track along with Jesus. But we have to kind of understand what it might have been like to be a first century Galilean farmer in the time of Jesus, and what it would have been like for them to sow seed. And so, on one hand, for us, it's not always easy to understand a parable, not because we're dumb or we don't understand the Bible. It's because we don't relate exactly, and we have to start doing a little bit more work to put ourselves in the sandals of those back then, or shoes if they had really nice shoes, but I don't think they wore bright, colorful shoes like I do around here. Anyway, so yeah, the other reason though is that we know that when we read these parables, sometimes Jesus' listeners understood them. Oftentimes the ones that understood them, as we're going to see, don't like what they hear. And then other times, people that really like Jesus, maybe he healed their family member, he showed compassion on them, and they're in love with Jesus, and they're going to follow him everywhere and listen to what he says. And then he says this parable, and they're like, what are you saying again? Even his disciples have to ask him in private constantly, hey Jesus, we didn't want to admit, we're your students, and you're our rabbi, so we're special, but I don't understand what you're talking about. So not only do we have to do legwork to get to the core of the context of the parable, but we also need to keep ourselves humble when we're talking about parables, because Jesus' earliest followers that definitely understood the context because they were living it even had trouble understanding his parables sometimes, which means we're not so horrible people if we don't always understand them. Sometimes we have to do a little bit of work and rely on the Spirit and do the study and all that. So that's the second one. And this one flows out. This is another misconception. Overanalyzing a parable will cause someone to miss its meaning. This is a favorite misconception of mine, and it normally is because some people really, let's say the first time they ever heard, we just did the parable of the prodigal son this past Sunday. No, we didn't. We did the parable of the Good Samaritan. We did a parable on Sunday. No, we did the parable of the Good Samaritan. Thank you. I was just testing you all to see if you were paying attention in church. No, the parable of the Good Samaritan. We just did that one. And let's say you grew up in church, and the first time you heard it, the preacher did an eloquent job, and it stuck with you, that one meaning, that one time. And this isn't to say their preacher was wrong, but remember, we've already established there might be multiple angles of meaning to this. And that person latched on to this one thing, and then 20, 30 years later, they hear it again. And someone starts saying, well, actually, there are different ways you can think about this that actually impact our lives and prompt us to live differently. And they're like, no, I've always heard it this one way. And so what they'll do is they'll say, well, you're just overthinking it. You're overanalyzing it. You're being a nerd about this story here. It's got a simple, plain meaning, and this is the key, and I know what it is. I want to encourage all of us as we go throughout this study to, again, I've used the word already, but take a humble approach to Scripture. I had a professor once tell me, because of a question a fellow student asked, they said, well, why do we study the Bible so critically? Like, aren't we tearing it apart? Aren't we deconstructing? And doesn't it show a lack of faith in Scripture if you're being so critical of what you're studying? And my professor turned and said, actually, it's because I have a very high view of Scripture that I study it critically, because the most critiquing I'm doing is critiquing my own interpretation. I never want to assume that I've got all the answers. I don't have all the answers. We don't have all the answers. We're all growing. We're all reading together. And so it's wonderful if you heard a parable one time and you got a lot out of it and you heard a really great message on it. Hold on to it. Just don't hold on to it so tightly that you're unopen and unwilling to study for more meaning, to better understand Jesus, and to follow him better. So no, overanalyzing a parable will not cause someone to miss its meaning. In fact, analyzing the parables and thinking deeply about it can help us draw out meaning from the text if we rely on God through the Spirit and we study and do all that. A parable illustrates an easily applied truth. This is a funny misconception because the truth that is drawn from a parable might be easy to comprehend at times. Easily applied is a different story altogether. Case in point, Dee Dee's wonderful sermon on the Good Samaritan. Got it right this time. No, his sermon this past Sunday, where he took this idea that was just beautiful. He said, the Samaritan in the story came close to the man that was badly wounded and took care of them, where the other two in the story, they moved away from him. And he took that and he applied it and said, in what way in life do we move away from people rather than move toward in compassion? And he brought out very, very difficult issues that we're all facing right now. So is the truth of that easy to comprehend and not along? We're all remembering together what was said on Sunday, and we hear that and we say, yeah, I'm with you, Dee Dee. That's right. I want to be more compassionate to people. Easy to apply? Not so much. Not so much. So that's one of the reasons we put that one. And this gets us into the core of our introduction tonight. This is kind of a cheat because it's not really a common misconception, although I've heard it before, maybe. Only Jesus taught using parables. No. Jesus is the word at the beginning. We learned that in the Gospel of John. So if we want to get hyper-technical because he's Jesus, I guess we could say he invented the parable. But if we're going to take Jesus' humanity seriously, because he's both 100% divine and 100% human, Jesus was a first century Jewish rabbi who happened to be our Lord and Savior, but he still walked and talked on this earth as a rabbi that made disciples. And they were parables being used long before Jesus was walking around and teaching on the earth. And today, even we speak in parables today, even though we don't stop and think, oh, that was a clever little parable that I just came up with or something like that. Which, of course, now I say that, I can't come up with one right now, but maybe later on I will. But the point is that if you read through the Old Testament even, and we're going to focus on one tonight, you will see that parables were used. Maybe not as frequently in the Old Testament as we see Jesus using them, but they are there. And there are actually probably more of them that we don't notice as such. And so there's that. So Jesus wasn't the only one that taught in parables. I would like to say that Jesus perfected the art of the parable and the way that he taught it, but he wasn't the only one, and they didn't originate there. And it's important that we recognize that, because when we look to Jesus, and this is a kind of a spoiler alert for our future Old Testament relevance class, when we're looking at Jesus, we need to understand that Jesus, being a first century Jewish rabbi, was a person that descended from Israel. He was from the line of David. We've got the genealogy and everything. And so Jesus chose to teach and make disciples through the conventions of teaching and rabbinical training that fellow rabbis of the Pharisees and Sadducees and so on would have used. And so to understand Jesus' parables, we have to understand what a parable is, and not just what its literary form is, but we also have to understand what a parable is in terms of its historical context. How did the Jewish people and the Jewish writings, called the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible or whatever we use, how were parables used then? Because if we understand and can grapple with the parts of a parable in the Old Testament, then we can apply that understanding to the parables that Jesus tells. So what we're going to do is we're going to look through defining a parable, and we're going to look at some Old Testament examples, and then we're going to land on a particular Old Testament example, which many of you will be familiar with. And when we land on that one, we're going to break that down, not just on its meaning, but we're going to look at its parts and say, what makes this parable such a good parable? And then in the next 3 weeks, we're going to use 3 different parables from Jesus as case studies to apply the work that we've done tonight in establishing what a parable is. Are you all with me so far? Online, are you with me? I hope so. I can't hear you. Aaron Adams nodded to me in the back, so I guess the online people are with me in some capacity. So how do we define a parable then? We've gone through misconceptions. We live in a world where it's easy to deconstruct, right? We're good at analyzing to tear something down, to pick it apart. But, well, that's fine. But what do you have if you pick something apart? You kind of got just something broken there. We want to put it back together. What is a parable? How does it function? How do we draw meaning out from it? So if you've been in church since we've been doing the parables, you've heard this definition every single week, and you're going to keep hearing it until it's drilled in your mind. I'm just kidding. This is our definition of a parable, thanks to the assist from my good friend Bobby. It's a parable is a short story, proverb, or riddle meant to challenge one's notions and provoke change in one's life. And this is always the caveat to this: if the hearer's heart is ready to understand and apply the message. So that's how we're defining a parable. And to stop and flesh some of that definition out, a few key ideas here. One is that it's meant to challenge one's notions. So while Jesus, for instance, will use stories about everyday life so that people can connect with the story, they can put themselves in the story, for instance, because the daily life he's speaking about is common to them and they understand it. It's not meant to be. It's not meant to simply be understood, but to challenge. So if you hear one of Jesus' parables and you immediately nod along, smiling in agreement, you might have missed the point because it's meant to challenge us. And sometimes being challenged doesn't feel so great, although it helps us grow, which is the beauty of it. The second part of this is similar to the challenge, but it's to provoke change in one's life. And I want to note something here, especially considering that we use the terms apply the message at the end of this definition. The parables don't typically say at the end of all of them, therefore go do X, Y, Z. You know, oftentimes when we start talking about the will of God for our lives, we want God to tell us what car to drive, what house to buy, what job to take, when to, should I go to the park next Sunday? I don't know. Let me pray and see if God, I should go to the park. Okay, that's nice. I guess the weather's going to be nice because he said yes. We're looking for that kind of practicality all the time. Jesus isn't always interested in that level of practicality because, as we've already established, because there's not always one simple meaning and always an easily applied truth, is because the parable is meant to take root in your life so that you live it out in many different avenues. So to go back to our sermon on Sunday, there's a reason Dee Dee laid out 3 different challenging scenarios in which to live out that parable. Because you can hear one story of Jesus and find many different relationships and spaces that you operate in life where you can apply that particular parable. So when we're talking about provoking change and applying the message, we're not necessarily saying that we're supposed to grasp some concrete takeaway where I say, oh, I get what Jesus was saying about that farmer, therefore I'm going to go to this person and do this or that. That might be one aspect of it, but there are probably many other opportunities to live out that parable. And then the addendum that we have on here, or the qualifier or what have you, is if the hearer's heart is ready to understand and apply the message. And this is the key. When you're reading the Bible, it'll always tell you that Jesus is speaking to his disciples or a crowd or the Pharisees or so on. Even at times when we see Old Testament parables, you'll see them spoken to a particular figure or something like that. And when that person hears the parable, they might respond in a different way. They might not understand it. And so, for as many times as the disciples are willing to own up to not understanding what Jesus was saying, we don't always get to hear how many people walk away confused. I won't get into Monty Python's The Life of Brian here. I was imagining the blessed are the cheesemakers, all the people misunderstanding. Anyway, not that kind of misunderstanding. So people might not understand it. There needs to be understanding of the parable to be able to apply it. But then you find people who will hear Jesus' words and they'll understand it, but they don't respond accordingly in the way Jesus intends. And this tends to happen the most with the religious elites or leaders that Jesus comes in conflict with. Oftentimes, you'll get this little line at the end of Jesus saying, it'll say, and the Pharisees and chief priests understood that he was talking about them, and they looked for a way to plot and get rid of him or the like. Jesus' parable was not told so that they would go figure out a way to crucify him. That's not the point of the parable. So you can understand a parable and still not be in the right place to apply it. Your heart might not be ready for that. Or you might be in a good place where your heart's ready to apply, but you might not understand the parable, and you might need to do more work, more prayer, more this, more that, more study in order to get to that point. And so the parable fully received is one that is both understood and applied in life. So we want to do the work to do that. And I've got some examples here of what I just said from the Gospel of Mark of an instance where someone fails to comprehend it versus someone understanding the meaning but deciding to operate differently in there. So that way you can check my work on that. So what are some examples of parables in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible here? I'm not going to read all of these. I want you to note here that we picked out a few of them. Judges 9, 7 through 15 is an example here where Jotham was told, and he climbed up to the top of Mount Gerizim, and he shouted to them this parable, and it involves, one day the trees went out to anoint, and it's a very weird parable, but it's interesting. I encourage you to read it. There's one of them. If you turn the page or you scroll down online, you will see the one that we're going to land on here. And the reason we picked this is it's a familiar story to a lot of people. They don't stop to think of this being a parable because of the way the narrative flows. But also it is a very plain parable in terms of getting it. So, if we're going to start teaching on how to understand a parable, it's kind of like when you're learning to play an instrument or learning to speak a language. You always start out with the basic stuff. Because if you get too far into like the weird ones, like the one that's in Judges there, it's easy to get lost in the shuffle there. So the one in 2 Samuel is the classic one with Nathan and David, and we're going to spend some time there in a moment. Now this one in Isaiah is interesting because Isaiah has a lot of poetic form to it, and so what you have in this particular example that we've put here is something poetic where a parable is done within the form of poetry. And that, we wanted to use this example because oftentimes we'll miss a parable because we're already focusing in on a particular literary genre we're looking at. And that pesky Bible, it likes to do a number on us sometimes. It doesn't like to stay consistent on its literary genres. It'd be nice if it would just tell you at the beginning, this is a book of poetry, and it's going to stay that way through the rest. But it doesn't always work like that. And so the reason we put this one in here is when you read it, you will start to notice some telltale signs of parable language. And so you're like, oh, okay, well, we're moving from something, and now a parable's being told. I wonder what that's for there. So we got the one from Isaiah, and then we put one here from Ezekiel, which I just finished reading in my own personal time, and Ezekiel is an interesting book. And I always think that every single time I cross through it, and it never baffles me. But so we've got this one from Ezekiel. So before we get into our case study for the night, which is going to lay out how we're going to look at all the Jesus parables, I want to make a comment about some telltale signs of a parable, especially when you read them from Jesus. One of them is a classic storytelling trope. Sorry to use the word trope, but as far as a tale is concerned. And, even as a dad that's starting to tell stories to my son, who hasn't heard once upon a time? Oftentimes you'll hear Jesus say something like, one day there was a man, one day there was a vineyard owner, one day. Right there, it should clue you in. Jesus has gone off from talking reality and into story time with his disciples. So he's had the lights dimmed down, got their blankies up with them, and crowded them around. And he's going to tell them a nice story that is going to baffle them. And that is the case even in the Old Testament. So, you will often see, there was once so-and-so, or once upon a time, or I don't know the once upon a times. We should put that into Bible translations. We'll work on that one. But you'll get this kind of clue or cue that we're going into a parable at times. And one thing that we've already established as we were looking at both the misconceptions and the definition is that parables almost always they almost always storify, that's a fake word there, but real life instances. Some of us are enjoying nice decaf coffee right now, or some might have got the fully leaded over there. We might walk in with a buddy to a coffee shop, and we're talking about life, and they're pondering some big issue in their life. And if I were really astute, I'd say, there once was a barista that put coffee beans in the espresso machine. And I would go on and I'd tell a story that basically is talking about coffee. And then I'll end it and say, now, based off of that, you should just do like that barista in your life circumstance here. That would be the example of a parable. The reason that I say that is that if Jesus were in the room with us in the flesh right now, standing here, and he wanted to tell us a parable, he would grasp something in our day-to-day that made common sense to us that we are used to doing, and he would tell a story about that. And the reason that's important is, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, we have to, in order to best understand a parable, be willing to go back and answer the question for ourselves as best as we can. What might it have been like to be a farmer, to be a sheep herder, to be a vineyard owner in that time? And imagine the different nuances and the different details of Jesus' story unfolding so that we grasp not only the details, but they can really ponder the meaning of the parable with those details in mind. And so even in the one in 2 Samuel that we're going to look at, that is what happens with Nathan. It's one of the prophet Nathan. That's why David gets so enraged in the story that he hears. It felt real to him. This scenario was plausible. Now, I just said that, and this brings me to the third part about parables, and this is the best part about Jesus' little short stories. While Jesus will stick with details that are common to regular life on a regular basis, he will oftentimes embellish or make extreme those details. What I mean by that is if he tells a story about 3 different people earning different wages of money, if you actually look at the dollar figures, the dollars and cents that Jesus says, and you understand the equation in that culture, they're astronomical figures. Like people hearing this story will be like, okay, I was tracking with you, Jesus, but no one has that much money just handed to them by their business owner. That doesn't happen in my world. So Jesus will sometimes also say things that are outrageous in these common stories in order to draw out the emotion and bring more connection to the people. That's why even those of us that like, if we've ever read fantasy novels like Lord of the Rings, or if you're like me, I grew up a comic book geek. I still like all the comic book movies and things like that. We're able to suspend reality and imagine wizards and ghouls and flying men with capes, even though that doesn't happen in our day-to-day life. But we still can imagine those things being plausible because we've allowed ourselves to enter into a world where those things are possible, and they can still bring a moral point home or get us to think or to be inspired. So while Jesus tells stories using common everyday language and everyday things that people are experiencing, sometimes he brings the outrageous in order to drive up the meaning and to pull on the emotion strings to pull you into the story. And this is where it gets difficult. If you don't put yourself in the shoes of the people living back then to understand the details of that, you might miss the outrageous components that also provide meaning for us. And then, the parable, much like it does for Jesus' disciples, goes completely over our heads. And so those are 3 really high-level things that you want to look for in a parable. And so the one we're going to look at, and this is the other reason, again, that we picked this one, is all of those elements end up happening in this little story that Nathan tells David after David had sinned with Bathsheba and then had her husband Uriah the Hittite murdered. Now, in your packet, we have the whole, not only the whole parable, but the aftermath of it. And we're going to look at this whole text here because I want us to see not only what the parable says and what it means here, but also the reaction David has here. And so I'm going to read it really quickly here, and then we'll go into this case study, and then if you have questions, you can jump in. So it says, the Lord sent Nathan to David. When he came to him, he said, there were 2 men in a certain town, one rich and another poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, as surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity. Then Nathan said to David, You are the man. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you, and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah, and if all of this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. This is what the Lord says. Out of your own household I am going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Nathan replied, the Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die, but because of by doing this, you have shown utter contempt for the Lord. The son born to you will die. Now, this is one of the most famous stories in the Old Testament. Pretty sure there's been like movies about David and Bathsheba made. People know the story. Maybe not all the story, but they know about the story. And so Nathan comes speaking on behalf of the Lord, and he could have started with just laying into David with what his punishment will be, but he starts out with a parable. He tells a story. And so when we are going through a parable, there are some questions that we might want to ask. And the first one is, what were the surrounding circumstances that led to the use of Nathan's parable here? Well, we know that David's anointed king of Israel. He was known as a man after God's own heart, but he slept with Bathsheba, impregnated her, and had her husband killed in battle. So we're hearing this story in that backdrop. So there's a story context here. We know something happened in history and time, and Nathan is bringing this parable to respond to that. But then there's also some background things, and these are not necessarily in here, but they go in with the question, with this first question, and that is, why would Nathan have used a story like this? Why would he talk about a rich man and a poor man, and the rich man's vast amount of livestock versus this poor man's one little ewe lamb? Well, there's a couple things here. One, economic disparity existed big time back then. A person that was well-to-do was in the upper echelon, and there was no middle class. There was typically the people on the up and up, and then everybody else who were scraping together to get by. So David is in the upper echelon. He can relate to being the one that has a lot, and we know this because, well, God through Nathan here says as much to David after David gets angered by the parable. He says, I've given you everything, and if you wanted more, if this wasn't enough for you, I'd have given it if you'd asked. But you did this instead. So David, as an individual, can relate to the rich person in the story. David also can relate to being the nobody. Well, let's not forget, he was a shepherd boy. He was the youngest in his family. He was the son of Jesse. We don't get the impression, they couldn't have been too bad off because they had livestock and he was shepherding it, but he wasn't anything special. There was nothing notable about David, which is probably why God made him the anointed one at that point in time. So David actually can relate to both individuals in the story, but not only can David as an individual relate to them, these two people, the rich man and the poor man, were common people in this world. This was normal. People, if you were rich, you owned a lot of livestock, and if you were poor, you might not have had much. You might have had one to your name, and you would have counted it precious, a blessing. You would have done everything to take care of it. If it got injured, it would be a travesty for you. And then, so we talked about, how parables will use common circumstances and common real-world things, but sometimes they get into the outrageous. here's the outrageous thing in the story. Although, if we think about economic realities and power in the world, maybe it's not so outrageous. But to David, it was outrageous. What do you think might be the outrageous part of this story? Anybody? That could be, well, they're definitely, let's say that the fact that they had only one is meant to really create a gap between the two people, so that might be one. There's another one that I'm thinking too. Anyone? Well, that comes after the parable. That's a whole other topic for another day to get into there. That one's the hard part. Yeah. I'm sorry. Yes, and for you online too. The baby dying at the end of the story there. Yeah, David had everything. Yeah. So, who could David have taken everything he wanted that he had? Could David have taken everything from his own? Okay. That's the outrageous part of the story. That a rich man that had everything at his disposal would go and take the one little ewe lamb from the poor person. Part of the reason that's outrageous is most of the time the well-to-do rich man probably doesn't know the little poor man exists. Well, he's not going to know about the ewe lamb. That's the outrageous moment in the story, is that the person that has it all goes and takes the one. There's two reasons we know that's outrageous. One, even for the most greedy person, once they've amassed all that their greed desires, they still, again, don't normally even know the existence of other people around them to know what they have to take in the first place. But the second reason, and the scriptural basis for knowing that that's the outrageous part, is that's the part that infuriates David. Remember we said that in parables, the outrageous tends to get used to draw the listener in, to drive up the emotion, to pull them into the core of the story. Well, when you read that story, when you read that parable, and you read about David's response, it says that David burned with anger against the man because the man did this. He starts, he must die, and then he says, he must pay for that lamb 4 times over, which is hard to pay for after you're dead and your stuff is taken from you. But anyway, this just shows you how enraged David is when he hears this story. In this little parable that Nathan tells, we get all the hallmarks of a parable. We get the intro to the story. There were 2 men. Once there was one man. One time there was this. There was a tree one time in a garden. Here there were 2 men in a certain town. Ding, ding, ding. We're hearing a parable from Nathan here. What else do we have here that we've identified? Well, he's using real life circumstances. Rich people have a lot of livestock. Poor people not so much, but they would have cherished what they did have. And we have the outrageous here, that the person with everything at their disposal to take care of being hospitable to this traveler could have pulled from their own, and they go out and take the one thing from the person. And it's the outrage that captures David the most. And by the way, when we're talking about the common things, the common day things, that's another aspect of the story that we didn't even touch on, and that is that hospitality was a big deal in this culture. So someone comes to your home, you go get the kettle on, and you get the fire going, and you make them a meal and get them something nice to drink and clean their feet and all that stuff. You make them feel at home. I can tell you that is a common cultural value that still persists over in that space today. I've experienced it. So that is another thing that would have been common, and is another reason that David would have been enraged here, because not only did this rich man in the story do something horrible to this poor person, he did it in order to takes a good value of hospitality and turn it into a malicious situation by stealing something that didn't belong to him to make himself look good to a traveler. Now, we know Nathan's just telling David a story. This didn't really happen. That's another hallmark of a parable. Sometimes there are parables people ask me about a particular parable. What does Jesus teach about heaven and hell? Wasn't there this one parable? Well, we might want to be careful by drawing too much about reality from the parable there before we do that. But the reality here is that Nathan's telling a story, but it's so grounded in both reality and yet so outrageous that David thinks, oh, this is real and this is bad. And by the way, David's the king, so if he wants to go find the person that did this, he can make them pay the way that he says they deserve to pay. Unfortunately, it turns out, yeah.
In this particular case, David, too, could think back to when he was the shepherd,
Mm-hmm.
more the little man.
Yes.
And could think of it if somebody stole from us then.
Oh, absolutely.
Didn't have it.
Yeah, David could, to repeat that, David could remember back to being the poor person in the story and knowing how he would feel if this happened to them and relate at that level. So David's emotion strings have just been pulled right out. And it needed to be because he was in a bad way. This sin that he committed ended up being like a major negative turning point in his life, and he needed to be zapped out of the frame of mind that he was in there. So we already covered some of the other ones. How did David initially respond? Well, he becomes angry and declares that this rich man needs to die for his sin. David is convicted by the parable. How was David convicted by the parable is one. And this is a little tricky in this story because you could say David was convicted by the parable. David was angered by the parable. His conviction didn't come until he realized the parable was told about him. So he didn't actually pick up that the parable was pointing at him right away. Nathan, with the word of the Lord, had to lay into him pretty good. But it ended up convicting him. And as we'll see in some instances, that's not always the case. When people find out a parable is about them, they don't always repent. They do the opposite of that. So that's how he was convicted. So what lessons or assumptions about parables can be drawn from this sequence? So here's a few bullet points, and this will be our close for the night. And then if you guys have questions, and if you have questions online, we can do those and call it a night. The first one is that a parable is often used to correct wrongdoing or to shift someone toward a different path. So the reason that we use both of these phrases, the correction of wrongdoing or to turn someone to a different direction, is that, especially when we get in the New Testament, Jesus definitely would use parables to convict someone that's wrong-headed, that's trying to justify themselves. But sometimes he's speaking to a broader group of people that actually have a desire to follow him, but they don't know how to do so rightly, and so he's trying to get them on the right path. And so parables aren't always used to find someone in the deep, dark pit of sin and pull them out of it, but they can be used that way. Sometimes parables are just good to teach the person that is open to God, but doesn't exactly know how to be on the right path. And so we see that at times in the parables. The second one here is that a lesson delivered in the form of a story can provide a more vivid or memorable lesson than a basic statement of truth can. This is why stories matter. Actually, I read a few years ago about the reality that you will get more people to donate if you to a cause if you tell one story that brings the cause to life and its importance to life, than if you put a data sheet in front of someone and say, "This is how many people are affected by this. This is how much money it'll take. Will you please give?" people normally will give based off of the one story than all the info or the basic bullet points. And so I think that's why story is so prevalent in the Bible and why Jesus used it all the time, because it's captivating. It gets you to think about the characters in the story. It gets you to put yourself in their shoes. It pulls you in emotionally. It makes you think, what would I do in that circumstance? And it provides it elicits the openness to try and apply the message much more than if someone just tells you what you should or shouldn't do. You know, a lot of people might tell you they want to be told what to do and what not to do, but the moment you hand someone a list of do's and don'ts, they oftentimes will find ways they can skirt the issue. Yeah. It's an oral culture, yes. Yes, that is true. As an oral culture, it would make it more memorable. But we do know that that even the commandments, the thous and the thou shalt nots, are often delivered as one line. So even in an oral culture, people had recited moral commands and things like that. But stories in this form were more captivating, and definitely more so because this was an oral culture. Because yes, the vast majority of people could not read or write, not only because there was no education in a formal sense to teach people to do it very often, like you had to be in a special position or a special place in society, but even the instruments to write and to own something to read were not cheap, and they weren't easy to come by. Thus making, we live, we have way too much stuff to read. We can't even figure out what to read because it's all on our phone nowadays. But back then, that wasn't the case. So yeah, people had to hear stories, and it was relying on verbal and stuff like that. Yeah, so that would make that another key reason why parables would be powerful. The third one here is that a parable can easily be misconstrued in both its details and its implication. The parable we looked at doesn't necessarily capture this so much, although you could say that David misconstrued the parable because, well, he immediately thought there was actually a person that did this horrible thing and he wanted to bring them to justice, and didn't catch on that he was meant to be the one convicted by the story. The other aspect of this, and this is more for us reading today, is that, and this is the nature of the Bible, I'm sure you all know this, we love as a culture to take things out of context and misapply them to prove our own point to people, to win an argument. And so, people love to take the sayings of Jesus and then turn Jesus into their mascot for their cause, their politics, their this or that. And parables can be misused and misconstrued in that way too. And so it's important that we pay attention to the details and the context so that we understand it. And the last one here is that a parable becomes convicting once we see our own flaws and lack of insight represented in it. And this comes back to that last point, or that last part of our core definition, that a parable, if you don't have the humility to recognize your own flaws, your own sinfulness, your own need for God to help you to grow and to be on the right path, you'll listen to a parable never thinking it has anything to do with you. Or worse, and this is what we as modern readers tend to do, we tend to read parables thinking that whatever the good person or the good deed in the story is, that must represent us. Especially if we're church people, because, I'm sitting in church, I must be the good guy in the story, and so we do that, and we're losing out on something when we jump to that conclusion, because Jesus probably meant to course correct us or convict us in that story, just like he did his earliest followers, and so we don't want to do it that way. So, yeah, Pam. Yes. So one of the other challenges is We might read someone else as the bad guy in the story. Maybe we're in a little bit of a scuffle with a friend or, frenemy and a family member, and we were like, oh, well, that person must be the bad guy. I'm going to go tell them this story. Maybe it'll fix them or something like that. If you think that, just wait till you hear Dee Dee's sermon this coming Sunday. So that's a good segue into that. So that is our intro to parables, using Nathan's parable to David. And as I said, as we go on, we will look at 3 of Jesus' parables as case studies and apply what we learned, the things we're looking for in parables, and try to figure out what might Jesus have been saying to his original audience and how might that apply to us. So does anybody have any questions? Maybe there were questions online. If you do have a question and you don't mind, Aaron's going to bring a microphone because we do want the people online to be able to hear. That way if I forget to repeat a detail, they know. I think I did okay repeating what you guys said tonight, so thank you. That's a first. Now I have to do it 3 more weeks in a row. Anybody have any questions?
Since someone might hear a parable and not understand it, but want to know God and know Jesus, how did that work back then, and how does that work now?
That is an excellent question. So the disciples are the perfect example. And this is, I always like to tell people I say things that'll get me in trouble sometimes. This might be one of the things that gets me in trouble. Now it's broadcast on the internet. I don't think that our ability to check all the right answers on the theology and Bible test serve as the entrance exam into eternal life with God. We oftentimes think that we've got to get all the right answers in order to be right with God all the time. I have to know. And we normally show our hand in this when we start critiquing other people's perceived wrong answers. We think someone else is wrong on this theological position or this moral value, and we start drawing lines in the sand on who's in and out. And if that were the litmus test for our salvation, we'd all be disqualified and in big trouble. I promise you, as a former professor of mine had a blog, and I actually think this might be his Twitter handle. He always says he's seldom wrong and never in doubt. And I oftentimes like to think myself that way because I think I'm right about everything. But if you put me up to a lie detector, I will admit I'm probably wrong about a lot of things. And I will find out one day just how wrong I was. But I don't think that's going to keep me from being with the Lord forever in eternity. And the reason I can say that fairly unequivocally is because it was Jesus' closest followers, the 12 in private, who constantly said, Jesus, we don't understand this. In fact, if you read the Gospel of John, this is fun, you'll notice that it will often say his disciples didn't understand what he was meaning in that moment, but after he ascended to heaven or after he was raised from the dead, then they understood. And what does he mean by that? Well, there's this event that occurred in the book of Acts on the day of Pentecost called the Indwelling of the Holy Spirit. And so the thing is the Spirit gives us what we need and what we lack in our own fallenness, our own sinfulness, our own wrong-headedness. So does that mean that we should embrace ignorance? Absolutely not. Does that mean that we should just chuck the Bible and just say, well, I believe Jesus, so I don't need to do anything else? No. You should study the Bible. In fact, since we believe the Bible is inspired, by the Holy Spirit, we might want to read what it says to grow in our faith. So does that mean that we're going to have all the right answers about it all the time? No. So when we're looking at the parables, and that's why I kept saying at the beginning, humility, humility, humility. let's take a good road, a good step forward in saying, I might not understand this parable as much as I think I did. I wonder what it might have meant. And even if we don't get it after that, that's okay. Peter didn't either. And I think he's doing okay. So, yeah. Yeah, he's at the gate. Any other questions? Oh, it's seldom wrong and never in doubt. It's a snarky statement. And I'm seldom wrong and I'm never in doubt. That's, yeah. That was somebody else that said that. I can't take credit for it. I just apply it to myself. That's all. I'm just kidding. Any other questions about parables? Did we have anything online, Aaron, that you know of? No. All right. Oh. Thanks, Aaron.
So the disciples never really understood all of these. Would they go discuss them, you think, and then until they came to a consensus, yeah, this is what it means?
Well, I always like to tell people it's not always great to argue from silence on something. So we have a small number of times where the disciples, mainly Peter, who's often the spokesperson in the Gospels, will speak up and say, Lord, can you explain that parable's meaning or something like that? But we don't always get that after every single parable. Additionally, you could even read Peter speaking up as saying that Peter's lumping in the rest of his 11 buddies, and he's the only dummy that didn't get. I'm just kidding. It's hard to say. So what we can draw from those instances where they didn't get it is that some people didn't get it sometimes, including those handpicked by Jesus. It'd be one thing if the 12 were always portrayed as picture perfect. They understood everything. They did it right all the time. And then, maybe the no-name person in the back of the crowd said, hey, Jesus, I don't know what you mean. And then, his 12 were like, you fool, we're special and we got it. But they never do that. So the reality is I'm sure that there were people that did understand it. We're not told that that's the case. When we are told, like we've mentioned here, sometimes the people that get it are the people that are the smarty pants of the culture, and they're the ones that are not good at applying it, which I don't know what that says about people that are smarty pants. We might want to be careful. What was that? Yeah, and the tax collector was the good guy in one. So, yeah. Anybody else? All right. Well, thank you all for being here tonight. I really appreciate it if you're online. Thank you. We will be back next Thursday at 7 o'clock, and we will go into the second week. How was that? Yeah, we'll be in here. Yeah, we are doing this so that we can broadcast online for those that wanted the online option. So, have a good night.